Everybody, thank you for joining us. We have all of you that you can see each other. We also have 7 people that are non-video participants hiding in the background. I know many of you here's Matt Dean showing up. Perfect. So we got one more. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Matt Kettman. I am a Santa Barbara-based journalist, although I'm in Santa Cruz at my mom's house right now, Aptos specifically. So as lovely as this painting is, it's not actually mine. I started working at the Santa Barbara Independent back in 1999 and started covering wine soon after that. And then in the last 10 years, it's become a lot more intensive part of my career. I wrote for Wine Spectator for a long time and a little bit for New York Times. And then since 2014, I've covered the Central Coast for Wine Enthusiast magazine. So I review about anywhere from 150 to seemingly during the COVID times, about 350 wines a month from more or less Santa Cruz Mountains all the way down to Santa Barbara. And I also do Southern California, like Temecula primarily and places like that. But bulk of what I do is Santa Barbara County. I'm just about to publish my first book, which is a book all about Santa Barbara County winemakers, and the 3 that are here. We have Edgar as well, but he's based in Paso. The 3 that are here are part of that book. That'll come out in October. And so here we are today to talk about Ballard Canyon. As you all know, I hope you got the materials ahead of time. The 4 winemakers we're going to hear from are Michael Larner here from Larner Vineyard and Winery. We have Matt Dees from Kimsey, who he helped build that estate and make some great wine for them. We have Stephen Gerbach from Rusak Vineyards, and we'll hear from him. And you'll learn that actually, while Syrah is a big part and Rhones are a big part of Ballard Canyon, you can do other things there too, like Sauv Blanc and Zinfandel. And then we have Edgar Torres from Bodega de Edgar in Paso Robles. And I've been noticing a good amount of Paso winemakers buying Ballard Canyon fruit. And I thought having Edgar here to show some of that stuff would be kind of insightful for you all too, because it does have a little bit of a different style to it sometimes, a little more power and lushness. So I thought that'd be kind of a fun twist for the whole thing. To just give you a quick little scene setting before we pass it off to Michael to talk about other parts. Ballard Canyon is part of the Santa Ynez Valley, which was created as a wine growing appellation way back in 1983. And that's about 42,000 or so acres. And then by the late 90s, early 2000s, it started being divvied up by winemakers who started to realize that this, 30-mile long east-west focused or east-west oriented valley could grow completely different grapes on one side. So on the west side, where it's really cold near Lompoc, you can do Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and some cooler climate, Syrah and other Rhones. And then farther in and towards Happy Canyon, you can do grapes that need a little bit more heat, like some of the Bordeaux varieties. And so you see a lot of Cab, Merlot, and even some Sauv Blanc and stuff like that coming out of Happy Canyon. Ballard Canyon was created in 2013. The movement started a little bit before that. I know the Rusak property goes back to the mid-70s when it was founded as the Ballard Canyon Winery, which was known a lot more for, I think, fun, raucous grape stomps than it was for quality wine. But the Rusaks came in the early to mid-90s and bought that property and really changed it around. Early 90s is also when the Stoltman family came in. The Larners were pretty soon after them, and started planting, some grapes and exploring, like you did in those days. No one knew what was going to do great there, but once they kind of settled on Syrah, the Syrah really started to show, really unique characteristics that kind of blended the warmer, lusher styles with some of the cooler climate styles too. So I've heard Michael many times say it's kind of like the Goldilocks area for Syrah, because you get a little bit of both of that. The interesting thing about Ballard Canyon is that, while the Santa Ynez Valley is this large east to west valley, thanks to the transverse range twisting and opening it like that, Ballard Canyon is actually more of a north-south kind of slot in the middle of the whole thing. And so basically, early 2000s, you have Santa Rita Hills carves himself off. So the far western edge of the Santa Ynez Valley, they say, hey, we can do Pinot and Chardonnay here. We should do that. And so they're created by, I think, 2001 or so. And that's actually fairly large. It's 30,000 plus acres with almost about 3,000 acres planted there. The next one you see is Happy Canyon. So on the far eastern edge, that's 24,000 acres, but only about 500 or so planted. And then you see Ballard Canyon pop up in 2013 which is a pretty tight little appellation, only about 7,700 acres. But if you're looking at it, it has about the same planted acreage as Happy Canyon, which is something I kind of, if the numbers are correct, something I kind of discovered this morning. So even though it's really, it's only about a third of the size of Happy Canyon, it has as many grapes planted. So it's almost to some extent a more explored area when it comes to grape planting. And Happy Canyon is really dominated by kind of a handful of big estates, whereas Ballard Canyon has, more than I think a dozen or so. I think we put that in the text sheets, but has a good amount of both vineyards that just sell grapes and then a number of wineries that are there too. So I think that's a good way to pass it off to Michael Larner. So Michael's background, he was actually a geologist before a winemaker. So Michael, why don't Great. All right, Michael Larner. Before we taste wine, and you should all have the order of wine that we're going to taste in, which is the Sauv Blanc, the Kimsey Grenache, the Roussac Zin, the Larner GSM, the two bodegas, the Edgar we're going to taste back to back, the Larner Estate, and then finish with the Kimsey 15 Syrah. But before we even do that, I mean, you're welcome to start tasting whenever you want. I never like to hold people back, but Michael Larner is going to give us a little bit more scene setting for Ballard Canyon. He was a really big proponent of making this happen. And also, like I was starting to say, he has a geology background too. So he can kind of explain a little bit of that for us too, before we jump into Steve's Sauv Blanc.
Totally. And please do drink. I'm really boring without a glass of wine in hand. But yeah, thanks Matt for the intro. And I think there's sort of three key words that sort of define Santa Barbara and defining Santa Barbara's wine country include Ballard Canyon and its history. And that's, basically going to be transverse, marine origin, and diurnal temperatures. And as Matt can sort of lay the groundwork, but what's fascinating about Santa Barbara's wine country is its geologic past and how we are where we are today. And if you were to sort of jump back in a time machine, most of the land that formed around here 20 million years ago was actually underwater and down by San Diego, and has been slowly moving up to the north following the San Andreas Fault on the south side. So good news is we all have, beachfront property in San Francisco in about 20 million years. But no, so basically what's happened though is through tectonic uplift, compression of a lot of thrust faults that have moved and created a transverse mountain range, which is our southern border, which is that 30-mile sort of, chunk. What's fascinating for Ballard Canyon is we find ourselves equidistant from one side of the valley to the other. And so what that means is I like to jokingly call it the Goldilocks syndrome. We have this really cool confluence of cooler climate coming from the west, Santa Rita being so close to the Pacific, where our Ballard Canyon sits about 17 to 15 miles, depending on where you're at, from the Pacific to the west. Whereas on the east side, warms up dramatically and you go into Happy Canyon where we see all the Bordeaux varieties growing. So, that's why I jokingly call it the Goldilocks. It's not too cool, not too hot. It's just right for these kind of varieties like the Rhones, specifically Syrah. And so when we kind of approached this concept and Steve, I think it started with when John Falcone was at Roussac, but it morphed into, you jumping into it, Matt being around, we brought in Sashi and it kind of was born with this concept of tasting some Larner, there's my plug, tasting some wines from Ballard Canyon, with some sommeliers in our barn. And it morphed from that into when we were doing the Q&A with about 40 somms. Every question was like, why aren't you an AVA? And it's like, oh, okay, well, that's a pretty valid question, and one that we kind of never really thought of, because when Dr. Gene Halleck planted in the 70s, it was Chardonnay, right? Dr. Fun Baby Chardonnay. You had probably Muscat Canelli and all these kind of things. But some of the pioneers that came after that, Stoltmans and Beckmans and Honada and ourselves, really realized the propensity to do Rhone varieties and specifically Syrah. And so we jumped into that really because of the fact that when you look at the diurnal temperatures the fluctuations allow for maximum ripeness during the day, but locking in acidity through those cool evenings. And so that's kind of paramount for Santa Barbara County in general. But when you start laying out that transverse running valley, you have to be far enough away from the Pacific to get that optimal ripeness for grapes like Syrah. And so when we all got together and decided in 2010 and 11, like, hey, this is something we should do, because we have enough historical data, we have enough climatic data, growing conditions, all these kind of things, then we can tie that into, okay, well, there's a common thread here. And what was kind of paramount was starting to look at the soils reports, starting to look at the geology part, because climate and geography are important, but also going back to that, marine origin. What's fascinating about Ballard is almost everybody's topsoil has a similar profile, where we have, most of us have sandy conditions. It's technically called a marina sand. If you look in the old, soils reports from the USDA and stuff. And that is a pretty young quaternary sand, so very young in geologic time history. And but that's eroded off of other substrata bedrocks that are either going to be chalk based or limestone based. And so on the southern side of Ballard Canyon, and I kind of like to think of as Ballard as like a heart shape, sort of right smack in the middle of the valley. In fact, it kind of physically looks like one as well, sort of circular. And on the southern end of that, we see more of the chalk. In fact, if you ever had the pleasure of driving from Solvang towards Ballard Canyon, you actually go on a road called Chalk Hill Road. And there's actually an interesting thrust fault that's right at my gate, where you'll see chalk on top of the hill opposite me, but then it's underneath us when you drive into our property. So there's actually sort of a reverse thrust where the chalk has been moved up. And so the substrata for us is chalk. The substrata for Kimsey and all that's going to be a confluence of that chalk with the sand, just like similar to ours. But as you travel north, the limestone starts to appear. So if you ever take chalk and limestone and break it down into powder, they're basically the same constituents. If you run them in and look at them, it's all CaCO3. So the idea is that you have a similar substrata, but in a different physical state. So limestone is stone, it's compacted, it's lithified. So the water retention, the available nutrients vary slightly. But the fascinating thing is also when you go up to the north, you start to see more fine particles in the soil. So it acts similar to a clay, even though it's still sandy or loamy. When you start to have fine, you have more bonding potential of the water, so it acts more similar to a clay. So in some areas, you actually have soils that are maybe 35% sand, but when you look at them, they almost look like clay to you, and they almost feel like clay. And I'll tell you from a farming perspective, they act like a clay in terms of water retention. And what I mean by that is vines fight the soil to get the water out. So they may have their roots in limestone or chalk, and they may have some stored water in those fractures that they can get their roots into, but the upper layer, and it varies between 3 to 6 feet. On my vineyard in particular, we have 6 feet of beach sand in some areas. And the vines are sort of in this matrix of stressful environment. They're not too happy with that sand, but when they have their roots down into the lime or chalkstone, they're gonna have something that carries them over. So it kind of creates that optimal condition where it stresses the vines to force them to make higher quality, is there smaller berries, more intense fruit characteristics, and all these kind of things. And I think going back to the concept of the AVA was when we did that tasting and we had all these people asking us, it's like, okay, well this is a industry supported idea, not an ego driven process. And so when we all kind of got together and sat in a room and looked at each other, we thought, you know what, this is good because we'll have people on the front line who are interested in supporting Ballard, but we want to give them some more ammunition. And so one of those concepts was let's clarify our sense of purpose by looking at what is the largest amount of grapes planted, which is Syrah, and let's give them a talking piece. Let's give them a keynote. And that was creating a bottle branding idea for an AVA, which actually, and maybe Matt can correct me, but I believe that's the only example still in California of co-branding across brands within a region. So that you might have all seen that. It's that Ballard Canyon in the shoulder that kind of goes around. And that was a unifying factor for us out here, because we realized that we needed to send a champion forward to sort of best represent Ballard. And the cool thing about that is it brings its kin along, so that, you know, the other Rhone varieties like, you know, Syrah, besides Syrah Grenache, Mourvedre, Viognier, you know, we could jump into other varieties like Cunoise, Carignan. I think a lot of people stay away from those because those are kind of a pain in the butt to farm. But it, you know, it opened the door to the Rhone world. But the fascinating thing is as you're probably trying right now, is a Sauvignon Blanc, those cool climates that we have here, that diurnal shift, that marine soil, that marine origin, kind of also are conducive to allowing an overlap with Los Olivos district, which is to the east of us, and representing different varieties as well. And Matt Dees may speak to the fact that I know he's pouring for Kimsey, but he also works for Honada, where they make some beautiful Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon. And so it is possible to do in Ballard, although it's quite extreme viticulture. The average, you know, temperature, the conditions are better suited for Rhones. No offense, Matt. But I think my point is that you don't have to work the hell out of the land to get that. And I think that's kind of when you realize that Syrah's in its happy place. And what I think is fascinating, I had the good fortune of working for Gigal in France, is what I think is fascinating is when you try the Syrahs from Ballard Canyon, they offer a very large swath, a kaleidoscope of flavors and aromatics. And you can pick and choose when you harvest from your estate to accentuate one or two. But it's unlike when you go to Santa Rita on the west side, where it's cool. You rarely get fruit where we have it. And or like when you go east to Happy Canyon, you rarely get pepper, which we have. So you have this, that's sort of like, I think this is kaleidoscope of a range that Syrah can offer. But, you know, Ballard Canyon's history, you know, besides the actual Ballard Canyon winery, didn't really sort of metamorphosize into the 90s. And thanks to a lot of interest from the Beckman family, Stoltman family, who kind of came, and a lot of them planted a lot of different varieties, sort of a shotgun approach, which allowed us to hone in on what did best, but also to some extent what clones did best too. Stoltman had a lot of Estrella and Durell. Durell is heavily virused. So, you know, a lot of people started to say, thanks, Pete, we don't have to plant that. We can look at other clones, other available options. And I think that's what you see a common thread with Kimsey, Larner, and Rusak, is a lot of their recent plantings are exploring these really fascinating and sort of solid clone selections.
Great. Thank you, Michael. That was a very detailed and informative further introduction to this region. And it's gonna be bookended. That was a lot about Syrah, and we're gonna have two Syrahs at the end. And I hope you do notice the bottles. The two that we have is the Larner 17 Syrah and the Kimsey 15 Syrah both have that Ballard Canyon bottle and the embossed thing on there, which I thought was not only, I think, a unifying aspect for the appellation, but as someone in the media, it was like, oh, here's another thing to write about too. Here's kind of a cool and very unique strategy that really is only being employed in Ballard Canyon as far as I really know. And you guys keep a pretty kind of strict hold on that. It's not like anybody can use that bottle too. You still have to be in the state vineyard as well. Is that still one of the rules?
Yeah, so the premise is a state vineyard producing wines from your estate. And that's kind of a subject for one of our next board meetings probably, but I'd like to see the 23 clients that buy fruit from me also be able to use the bottle. Granted, they are not on my estate, but they have been selling Larner wines or Larner branded wines for far longer than I've been making wines. So it'd be nice to see another 23 labels adorn that Ballard Canyon bottle out in the market.
Yeah, I think that would be a smart move too. So hopefully that does start to happen. All right. Speaking of actually tasting wine, Steve Gerback from Rusak, why don't you tell us, now that we know all about why we should be growing Syrah in Ballard Canyon, why don't you tell us about why you're growing Sauv Blanc and why, it works really well for other varieties too.
Yeah. So, Brusac, we totally replanted the vineyard in 2002, right around there. And we had the opportunity to bring in new varieties and planted Syrah, of course, but we also planted Sauvignon Blanc, and along with a few Bordeaux varieties. And, for a lot of the same reasons that Syrah did well in Ballard Canyon, so did Sauvignon Blanc. What we saw was just a really kind of a wide variety of the flavor profile. And we were able to kind of pick on the earlier side, and kind of wait and pick a little bit more fruit kind of on the riper side and make these really complex wines, and without getting too, fruit focused or too kind of like vegetal, especially with Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, so, we, of the 20 acres that we have planted here, about 10 of those are Syrah, planted 6 different clones, but I've also got a couple clones of Sauvignon Blanc, the Muscat clone, and clone 1. And with this particular wine here, we're able to pick our Muscat clone. It ripens really early. When I say ripen, I mean the pyrazines break down, the green bell pepper notes go away in the mid-20s sugar. So we're able to start picking super early. This vintage right here, we picked over 25 days. So we had 7 pickings over 25 days, and starting at, only 21 bricks and ending at 22 and a half. So we have like such a nice range of kind of flavors that we can choose from, make this blend. We do the cold fermentations, a little stabulation, really trying to express the aromatics. My goal with the Sauvignon Blanc is that when somebody else has the glass next to you, you kind of get a whiff of it. Like, I want it to be that aromatic. So that's really our goal here. And we do a little bit of barrel fermentation, but keep that to 5 to 10%. And I only ferment in it. So it spends 2 weeks in barrel, and some fruit oaks, some acacia, and then it gets blended back together. So again, the wine you have in front of you hopefully expresses kind of like what we've got, a broad range, a really kind of well-rounded Sauvignon Blanc that's still kind of acid-driven and fun,
And do you guys do any white Rhone grapes, or is this your primary? I know you do some Chardonnays from other vineyards, but do you any estate-grown whites beyond the Sauv Blanc?
We do not.
No.
Not my bag. So yeah, Sauvignon Blanc.
Right. And then you use all the Sauv Blanc from the estate. You don't sell any of it, right?
We don't sell any of it. Yeah. So we use it. I make a really small amount of like a barrel-aged Sauvignon Blanc version of this. It spends a little more time in barrel, but most everything else is 90% stainless, aged and fermented and then released, bottled in January and released soon after that. So.
Right. And do you find it's a nice white pairing to go with the other things you're pouring, the Syrahs and everything else?
Yeah, it's so refreshing. It's really a polar opposite of Syrah. But I just find that, having something that's like striking, aromatic, especially in our tasting room, when you kind of introduce people to Ballard Canyon, it just like refreshes their palate and, it just says like, okay, like, this is interesting. What else is out there? And then usually we kind of end on the Syrahs and get into that. So yeah, it's fun. Right. It's not Syrah, so.
Right. Great. And we can get a little more into the Brusac history when we get to the Zinfandel too, because I think that ties in a little bit better with their island connections and everything like that. But for everybody else, if anyone has questions after we go through a wine, feel free to chime in and ask them. Otherwise, we can do some at the end as well. But, I like these to be conversations as much as presentations. So if anyone has any questions, just jump in or put it in the chat or just let me know in some way. So, but let's move on to Matt D's. We're trying his Grenache. This is the 2016 Grenache from Kimsey. Tell us about, Kimsey might be a brand that's pretty small production, but an estate winery and vineyard. Tell us about the brand and how you got involved, maybe a little bit of your history, and then we can talk a little bit about the Grenache too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this special wine we have in our glass, the Grenache from 16, I think we made a whopping 62 cases. So not a great deal of it in the world, but all the attention and all the love and all the focus has been kind of paid into it. I started making wine in Vermont back in '97 and made my way out to Napa in the early 2000s, made wine in Napa in New Zealand. And, very much to Michael's point about the Three Little Bears, to me, Napa was a little too warm and New Zealand was way too dicey in the vintages. I was there 3 vintages, and I always say it was like biblically bad, right? It rained for 40 days. I thought there would be blood flowing in the rivers and frogs falling from the sky. But the opportunity to come to Santa Barbara for me was very much driven by, it's right in between. It has some of the California sun, but also a lot of the acidity that I found down in New Zealand, where the freshness, the vibrancy, the electricity is the defining character of the wines we make here. Ballard Canyon is no different. And when Nancy and Bill Kimsey reached out to me back in 2011, 2012, to make the wine for their estate property, I jumped on it because within the Santa Barbara County, like Michael was saying, Ballard Canyon is right on that crux. It's kind of right in between the Santa Rita Hills freshness, electricity, and the kind of riper side of Happy Canyon. And Nancy and Bill had planted this property back in 08, 09. It's 20 acres, so it's very small. It was planted with quality in mind. It was planted with all the lessons that had been learned from Ballard Canyon from its really early days. From 99 through 2004, we learned so much in Ballard Canyon from all the plantings. So the clonal selection was really driven by experience. Coastal Vineyard Care, who planted it, knew a lot more about spacing, the vine density, 2,400 vines an acre, 22 to 2,400. And it's amazing. The Kimsey Vineyard is actually the southwest corner of the Ballard Canyon. So arguably it's the coolest site. It's right as you kind of drive into beautiful downtown Buellton, the city of lights, the city of magic. And it's a little bit elevated up. It's a bit of a plateau. A majority of the vineyard is planted to Syrah. Obviously, there's a small amount of Grenache. It's one kind of a spine that comes down from some of the chalky soil that Michael is talking about through some kind of alluvial deposits and actually into a very gravelly bottom, which is something that's a little bit unique in Ballard. It really runs through that kind of southeastern section of Kimsey. I had the pleasure of working with Michael, with Steve, with so many exceptionally brilliant winemaking minds on the creation of this AVA. And, I studied soil science in school. I'm a soil dork and a plant nerd to the nth degree. And when I went into the AVA conversation, I was such an idealist jerk. Part of me was very against the AVA because in my mind, I was thinking, aren't we 100 years too early to make these decisions? Don't we need to spend all the time like the monks did, the Cistercian monks, and don't we have to dig 1 million soil pits, and don't we have to look at the watersheds and how they affect the water quality and what's happening and how the roots, dig cellars and see how the roots are coming in? I was my own worst nightmare and was supporting the AVA, but a little bit confused by it and a little bit skeptical. Fast forward these 8 years, every wine I taste from Ballard Canyon, be it red or be it the Sauvignon Blanc from Roussac, be it one of the beautiful white wines coming from Stoltman, it hammers home the fact that there is a tide that binds these wines. It's incredible. Tasting this 16 Kimsey Grenache, it's really interesting because what we're tasting is a very warm vintage from a very cool climate and a really cold vineyard site, because the Kimsey Vineyard is the first to take the brunt of the wind from the Santa Rita Hills. It takes so much of the fog from the Santa Rita Hills. If there's going to be a cold day in Ballard Canyon, it's going to hit Kimsey Vineyard the hardest. And that's the beauty of that, because to me, it skirts this edge between way eastern Santa Rita and way western Ballard Canyon. And we're seeing a sun vintage in 16, again, in a very cold site. and it just tastes like Ballard Canyon to me in the best way possible. There's this remarkable density of fruit, this concentration of black fruit and red fruit, and there's licorice, all the wonderful things we could talk about, descriptors that, you know, make me want to like shower for 5 days because I just hate talking about descriptors. But that dark fruit core is such a magic part of it. But then you get those cold nights all throughout the valley, and you end up with this shocking freshness. And this, it's almost like the wines kind of become very formal. Like they seem like they're going to be incredibly ripe, round, generous, kind of maybe just so easygoing and full of fruit. But then they get very formal. They put on an ascot and like tighten up their top button and tighten up their tie. And there's this structural integrity. There's a structural intensity. There's this very fresh kick of acid from those cold nights. And to me, they become chameleons, where your mind thinks one thing from the nose, your palate thinks another thing, and then all of a sudden that finish kicks all your ideas you had and shakes things up. For me, this Grenache, you know, I think it has such a powerful role to play. And now that the vines, you know, these vines were planted in 2008, so they were 8 years old in 16. The Kimsey Vineyard is unlike anything else I've ever seen in the world, and it's kind of living between two worlds, the warm and the cold climate. And this wine just really ties that up and shows an incredible level of sophistication today for me.
Great. And is the trellising on the Grenache like VSP? I mean, kind of traditional, or is it head trained, or something weird like that?
Yeah, no, it's VSP actually,
Okay,
and
yeah.
you know, it's one of John's clones. It's one of Albin's Grenache clones, and it doesn't seem to take zinc very well, so it shatters severely. The flowers don't stay open well, and with the wind that hits the Kimsey site, it yields very low. The clusters come in, you know, maybe 4.5 clusters a pound, which for Grenache is pretty crazy, because we've all seen, you know, like cluster a pound Grenache where it like would fill up my whole screen. At Kimsey Vineyard, it doesn't come off that way, and we tend to utilize about 6% whole cluster Syrah in the bottom of the tank. We destem the Grenache, you know, nothing magical. It's just the quality of that vineyard. And it's a very cold ferment. We don't spend a lot of time on the skins, and, you know, about maybe 18 days. Not a lot of pigeage, just very gentle pump overs. And it starts out a little quiet in barrel, and then just the volume turns up every year aromatically and certainly with that kind of inner energy and kinetic energy, for sure.
Yeah, that structure for sure is something that was standing out to me. I think you're right. It does, like, it puts a tie on a little bit and says, all right,
Yeah.
this is for real. I mean, it smells juicy, tastes juicy, but then really tightens up, which I think is fun. Whenever a wine for me does a little bit of a ride,
Yeah.
it feels like you got your money's worth or whatever, you know?
Yeah, and it's funny, right? Because wine is never a snapshot. It's always a moving picture. And you want to really load up at the beginning so that you have that structure to let it continue to develop and continue to be more of a complete journey. And the Kimsey Grenache to me is a wine that takes that journey very well.
Yeah. Great. All right, let's move into the Zinfandel. If no one has any burning questions, let's move into the Zinfandel and for something completely different and a great story behind it as well. So Steve, tell us about why you're growing Zinfandel from Santa Cruz Island in Ballard Canyon.
Yeah, so
actually, I should say I have a Santa Cruz Island Zinfandel wine in my yard. So I have one bush of Santa Cruz Island Zinfandel that does not get ripe at all, but I have it. So
it keeps the rats happy. The squirrels.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Rusacks have a long history of kind of family history on the Channel Islands, and they're really involved with Catalina Island. And a few years back, we had learned about a Zinfandel vine growing on Santa Cruz Island. And we were kind of asked if we wanted to kind of do anything with it. And we said, sure, let's go take a look. And we grabbed some cuttings, originally destined for a small vineyard we have on Catalina Island. Planted that and said, well, this is pretty interesting. Then we had some leftover vines at the nursery and sort of said, well, why don't we try this same clone grown in Ballard Canyon, a little warmer climate, and see what it does. What's interesting is anybody talking to anybody else, seeking out like what's going to be the best Zinfandel clone out there, would have just shunned this thing. It's got giant clusters, giant berries, tight clusters. I mean, it wants to get all the mildew and botrytis, you know. It's nice to be able to grow in a warmer climate here instead of Catalina, but you know, it ends up being one of our prettiest wines now. We originally had kind of gone through when we were planning the Zinfandel and said like, okay, Zin's going to be cool. Let's go buy a bunch of Zinfandel and see what we can do here. And that was probably the worst thing we could have done, because we all came out of that tasting saying, what are we thinking with Zinfandel? I don't think that's going to work in Ballard Canyon. One good thing that came out of it said, hey, let's try and make it like Pinot, and just keep it sort of fruit forward with nice kind of acid, and not go for super concentration. And let's see how that turns out. It took a couple of years. Our first vintage was 2012. So this was planted in 2010. And our first vintage was 2012. And those first vintages, we were still kind of playing with American oak on the wine, and we just found that to be really overpowering, and not as that pretty style we were looking for. So after a few years, we kind of dialed it in. This is our 2017 vintage. And, you know, we found that it's actually our highest acid variety on the property here. So I'm picking it at pHs almost exactly the same as Sauvignon Blanc. And it holds on to those acids. So it's great. It's own rooted, it's head trained, and we keep the yields down pretty good. Ruben's got to do a lot of work in there, keeping the yields down, because like I said, the clusters are big. We actually pinch off the bottom 20% of the cluster to try and get more even ripening clusters throughout. So as far as like winemaking goes here, we pick, you know, kind of 24, 25-ish. pHs are like 3.2. And it really showcases those red fruits. To counterbalance that a little bit, we do some whole cluster fermentation and kind of blend that back in later on. But I think it really kind of complicates the wine a little bit more and adds in a dustiness, which I think is kind of, I don't know, what I think Ballard Canyon adds to the Zinfandel. It was one of the best things that kind of happened to us, is not being able to talk to our next door neighbor and ask them what they're doing to their Zin. We had to just kind of go out, do it, make it like without any help, and really kind of try and make it our own style. And I think we have here. It's sometimes hard to get people to try a Zinfandel who expect it to be, you know, 18% alcohol with RS, you know, and just kind of exploding out of the glass. But, you know, we kind of, once you convince them to try this and say, look, this is a pretty wine. I mean, you have this with all sorts of food. It doesn't overpower anything. And that's really our goal here.
Yeah. I think it keeps getting better every year. And we've talked about this before, but I do like this version better than the one that's grown on the island, which is, I think there's just so much complicating viticulture going on out there that I've always found this one, at least out of the gates, to be more impressive and quite delicious. So really spicy too, which I really like. So
that's one thing at least we've found across the board between the island and Ballard Canyon, is there's this thread of spice. So, you know, we pick it 6 degrees higher bricks here than on the island, but, you know, it still holds on to that spice.
Good. Great. All right. Any questions for the Zin? Oh, I should also do a quick plug for your Mission grape, which is a similar story that you pulled off of Santa Cruz Island and then took you a few years to figure it out. But it's delicious. You sent me a bottle a while ago, and I accidentally drank the whole thing in one sitting. It was like one of those ones where you're like, oh, what happened to the rest of this bottle? And it's delicious, very refreshing, and a fun story wine as well. So
thanks, Matt.
Wait.
Any questions?
Yeah, wait. What was that about Mission?
Steve's making a Mission grape. He's making it good.
Angelica or
no?
Fresh red wine. It's delicious. I bought some.
I love crazy people so much. I love you, Steve. That's amazing. Is it delicious?
It's so good. Stop by. I have like 2 bottles left. I have to give them out of
Say
my
one.
personal
Say
stash.
one for me.
It's really good. All right, Michael Larner, let's talk about the wine you've got for us here, the Elemental, which is a GSM, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so our 2017 Elemental, this is we basically make this proprietary red blend every year. And there's sort of 2 Larner laws, as we call them. The first one is it has to be an almost all neutral. The aging has to occur almost an all neutral because we want the emphasis to focus on the varieties that are in that blend so we don't impede it or interfere with winemaking. And the other Larner law is Grenache must be over 50% in this wine. And the intent with that is to make our most food-friendly, approachable wine for the dinner table. So I've been making this since 2009. That's when we first started making wine from the estate. And to back up, Larner Vineyard was planted in 1999. So we were Larner Vineyard from 1999 till 2009. We became Larner Vineyard and Winery in 2009 when we started making about 10% of the vineyard for ourselves, 800 cases. And we wanted to do a GSM. We wanted to showcase what I like to call the 3-piece band, with Grenache being the lead singer. And the idea sort of morphed into moving the aging into larger formats, really softening the use of oak so that varieties come through. And the idea of locking in 50% Grenache or more brings in all the other food pairing combinations with white, like light meats, like pork, chicken, all these kind of things. So we want, because Syrah and Grenache and Mourvedre in Ballard Canyon can showcase, like Matt was saying, dark core, but we wanted a playful wine at the same time that can kind of show elegance and velvet. And that was sort of the premise behind making this wine, and jumped into it. And the label actually, ironically, is where our logo is born out of, and that actually represents a tool I used to use as a geologist. If you ever take one of those soil classes, you stack up all these sieves, you pour the soil in there and you shake it, and all the class sizes separate based on their passing through that sieve. So that shows you the fee scale, showing you the different sieve openings to separate out things like cobble, pebble, granite, silt, clay, all the way down. And so it's very fitting because it's all those elements that make up the soil, and hence the name Elemental was born for that wine.
Great. And it's twist top. Is it slightly lower priced than some of your other stuff too? Is it a little more affordable, or?
No, it's 36. It's twist top mainly because as a winemaker, I noticed that Grenache in particular is very sensitive to oxygen as it progresses in the winemaking, and hence why we don't use a lot of new oak. Hence why we moved from smaller barrels to bigger barrels. And then when I go back and started tasting the vintage wines, the 9s and the 10s, sometimes I think it was 2010, it was like 65% Grenache. And all of a sudden my lead singer wasn't the lead singer anymore. Syrah and Mourvedre started coming really omnipresent. And so I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, if I'm making antioxidative steps in the winemaking, I need to continue that into the bottle. So starting in 2015, we moved all the Elemental production into screw cap to preserve Grenache's importance and save its voice.
Great. It's tasting especially great today. So
thank you.
That's always good. And how much does the blend change vintage to vintage? I mean, I know it's mostly Grenache every time, but does the
the lowest it's ever been is like 51% Grenache, and then probably like 40% Syrah. The trick with making a blend, and when you fix a number, is you gotta hope that Mother Nature cooperates with those percentages. Grenache and Ballard Canyon specific clones perform really well, and other clones shatter every 3 out of every 5 years. So you really have to be patient with some of the yields. We have 4 clones that go into this blend. And also go into our 100% Grenache, which is clone 362, 136, 513. And then we have a proprietary clone, which I really can't tell you how it got here via suitcase. We use these clones mainly because we love the fact that some of them don't shatter as frequently. But when they do shatter, they actually thin the crop enough for us so we don't have to get excessively crazy by dropping a lot of fruit. So what is there, it gets preserved and then gets fine-tuned. And so looking at those 4 clones, yields are pretty solid from year to year, but we do have drought years where Grenache seems to suffer. And in those years, Syrah maybe takes a little bit more of a dominant seat. I think the highest it's ever been, Grenache has ever been in that blend is probably about 65%.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, let's move on to Edgar Torres. Like I said in the beginning, Edgar is a Paso Robles-based winemaker, has an interesting and really, I think, inspiring personal story, and then is also making some excellent wines, both from Paso and from the Santa Barbara area. So Edgar, tell us a little about yourself. Tell us about how you tuned into Ballard Canyon in particular, and then we could talk a little bit about these 2 wines, which I poured side by side. So that's my recommendation.
First of all, thank you for including me on this portion of the Ballard Canyon focused tasting, and thank you for including me with the guys. I mean, I've been a big fan of Larner Vineyard forever. Resourcefully, I started the project of funding it by acquiring varietals and grapes that I could work with that were distinctively different. So Bodega is more of a Spanish influence kind of scenario, but being in Paso Robles and that explosion of the Rome Revolution, when I jumped in working for the guys that I worked for, like the first guy I worked for in town was Matt Garrettson, who was the co-founder of Hospice de Rome. So working at Villa Creek Restaurant with Chris Cherry and seeing all his buddies who are still friends, you know, all the who is who now in Paso, were the kind of the inspirationals of seeing what Syrah and Grenache could do. And I remember Matt Trevison blending that Syrah Grenache and calling it kind of sticks and stones, and having some from Australia that were named kind of similar, and then stumbling into working with Augie Hug, who made Syrah and Pinot at the time as well. It was kind of fun to see Syrah. I really love Syrah. I wanted to make it. I just fundamentally developing the structure of the business and focus to be so Spanish influenced. The first thing I ever made was Grenache. I made what equated from a 1.5 tons to 4 barrels of Grenache from Denner Vineyard. And so at the time it was feasible to do it because back in 2005 it was a heavy crop year. Chris Cherry showed up with like 3 extra tons of it, and he was making it where all the guys were making it there at the old Garrettson facility. So I fell in love with Grenache, fell in love with the last name Torres, which is my last name from Spain. And so started kind of working around with the Rome varieties. I really kind of had the inclination that I wanted to make Grenache, but I had to market it by calling it Garnacha and playing with that term. But as I went on to work with Mac and Russell, when they were co-joining forces to create what they called Barrel 27, that kind of inclusion to that team really just exposed myself to a lot of more vineyards. Because I started with Denner, couldn't afford it on the second go around. So I went up to Monterey County, bought some Grenache and Syrah from up there where Augie was sourcing some fruit. And, you know, back 2010, 2011, I was seeing prices from Santa Barbara County, from Larner Vineyard, from other vineyards that were still somewhat reasonable, especially working with Mac and Russell, who were buying, you know, sometimes truckloads from Camp 4 and all those guys. And so I started getting my way around the cellar with Mac and Russell, and stylistically, I love what they do. They're different personalities, and it showcases in their wines. You know, you have your refined, restrained, but big structure wines that Mick Price-Myers makes that are definitely correlating to the old world wines that he used to share with me, and wines that I've been drinking from working with Garrison and Augie and so on. Reuben, I think it was 2011, came to him saying like, hey, look at this new project called Kimsey Vineyard. Like, you know, they were working with Sodovich Vineyard out in the Santa Rita Hills. And that Syrah is a whole different animal than what we get at Kimsey Vineyard, because I do get both of them now. And so I got my way into those vineyards in Santa Barbara, somewhat financially feasible through Reuben, who was coming to Mac and saying, you know what, take the whole vineyard one year and, you know, do the best and go for it. So I had the best blessing and luxury to be able to play with Kimsey Vineyard a couple years in a row, where we had all the a lot of the Masal blocks that came in from there that Ruben did. We had a lot of some Roussan. I played with some Roussan out of Kimsey Vineyard. And so for me, you know, Brussels was so funny one time. Kind of, we were all drinking in together late at night, and we were tasting each other's wines, and you know, endearingly he called it pansy wines. I make a little more pansy wines compared to both of them. And I'm looking at this two big guys. I'm like, yeah, you make wine to satisfy your physical structures. I make wine to satisfy my physical structure. And at the time, I was 20 pounds lighter than I am now. So I'm like, yeah, my wines are going to be more restrained. I married a pescan vegetarian, so our diet differs. So the wine stylistically that we were all producing definitely was dictated by our diets. And for me, I was trying to flirt with the idea of mixing what I think Matt D's touched earlier. It's like that cool flirting line of like taking some good ripe fruit with some good restrained savory fruit. And so the first time I ever produced the E Square, I blended Denner Vineyard Grenache with Monterey County Syrah, because I was looking for that pepper spice. I was looking for more of that kind of nuances from Syrah to bring to that fruitiness of Grenache and Paso. But then once I got my foot in the door with Kimsey, I think Matt hit it in the nail. We're like, yeah, we're like farthest west of Ballard Canyon, and we're like the farthest east of what we can be considered Santa Rita Hills. And so for me, blending the Kimsey Syrah and the Kimsey Grenache at times is heartbreaking, because the Grenache just screams beautifully, but I already have so much Grenache here in Paso and the Spanish clone Garnacha that we planted at Paper Street Vineyard. So it's funny because I'm going to plug this, but I am launching a new project starting at $75 a bottle. It is going to be 100% dedicated to the 4 varieties that I think still need more highlights, and my favorites, which is 100% Grenache, 100% Syrah, 100% Cabernet Franc, and 100% Petit Syrah. And so the first Grenache that we're putting is equal parts Paper Street Vineyard and Kimsey Vineyard. And I think the Grenache from Kimsey Vineyard has been talking to me for the last, since 2011, when I made the first one from there. But yeah, it is that the sweetness balance of both worlds in that vineyard for me, that I love blending the E Square. So the 2014 E Square, I believe, is 60% Syrah and 40% Grenache. And that one's showing its age. And when it comes to composing my wines, I really like to play with, you know, the music that I hear from the old world is something that transcends to the wines that I really want to make. I want to make wines that really are reminiscent to the inspirational wines from the old world. I think the old Rhone wines that I got, in a way infected by the bug of the early stages of drinking wine from the old world, with, you know, from Chateauneuf to Pop, from course Hermitage to the St. Joseph's Syrahs and stuff. It kind of really stayed. I like that beat. And so when it comes to composing my blends here, I'm trying to anticipate giving you a little fruit youthfully, but I want that kind of secondary flavors in 5 to 7 years to really start to showcase. I think the 2014 is kind of hitting that stride of kind of flirting with old world nuances. I think 2016, Matt was highlighting their Grenache, and this is the 2016 E Square is 50-50 Syrah Grenache. So just to kind of talk about the E Square stands for Erica, my wife, and my name, Edgar. When we started dating, her father gave us that nickname, the E Square. But when we started working in the industry and started making a little bit of wine, she really loved Syrah. And I used to make Syrah from Bassetti Vineyard with both Augie and Matt Gerritsen. And I love that austerity of the super cool climate. You got briny beef aromas, black olive tapenade scenarios. And she really loved that, and hints of blueberry into it. But for me, I really love that red fruit, spice, cinnamon, kind of clove aromas that you get from Grenache. And being a Mexican kid, I love stopping at Industrial Eats because hibiscus tea It's what my mom used to make in Mexico, the Jamaica, but hibiscus tea is a note that I get in Grenache. So I like playing with those and blending with those. And I think after the first one I ever made was in 2007. So taking that long journey to try to find the right home, Kimsey is that perfect scenario where you can get a little bit of ultra ripe at times, and then you can get that savory spices notes together. And so I used to try to blend two different vineyards, a cool climate and a warm weather climate, to where like after 2011, I'm like, this is the vineyard to go after. And I blended, just to do trial blends. I did the 12 with Paso, Monterey County, and Kimsey involved. Then 2013, I did half Paso, half Kimsey Vineyard. Then I'm like, you know what? The one that talks to me is Kimsey Vineyard. And I think the soil composition, it differs around that particular site as well. And then just, yeah, I think I get the best of both worlds. I get enough fruit and I get enough savoriness. So since 2014, I've been making the E Square the only wine that in my portfolio that is not Paso, because I can't get what Ballard Canyon microclimate has to offer in the soil, is to really flirt with that ripeness and savoriness blended together. So yeah, that's why we'll be there hopefully till we get kicked out. Hopefully never.
No, they're great. I mean, they're great wines, and I think it does exactly what you're saying. Is it has that ripeness of fruit, which we saw in the earlier Kimsey Grenache, but then with a lot of that savory pepper and meat kind of spices as well, which is why I wanted to have some of these wines in here.
Well, thanks for including us.
Yeah. Great. Let's move to the stars of the appellation. Now that we've tried all these other delicious wines, to show you that it's not just a one-trick pony. Michael, let's talk about your Syrah. We'll start with the 17, and then we'll finish up with Matt D's on the 15 Kimsey. So let's talk Larner Syrah.
You got it. Yeah. So we got the 17 Estate Syrah. I actually make 4 different Syrahs every vintage. 3 of them are from the estate normally. And this one in particular, we call it the estate because it comes from about either between 4 or 5 different blocks, giving on the vintage. So they come in different clone, different rootstock combinations. The winemaking takes on slightly a similar program in the beginning with the fermentation, yeast choice and all that kind of stuff. But then when it goes into aging is when it sort of diversifies. I tinker with American oak a little bit, but mostly French oak and a smidge of Russian oak. So when those are all sort of gone in there, after the 2-year mark, we start blending in Syrahs, making our estates. Some of that Syrah that we find more playful go to elemental, and the ones that really exceed our expectation or show great age-worthy characteristics go after the reserve program. And so I love this Syrah because it showcases both the estate, but also the fresh vibrancy, the crunchy character that you get from Syrah with blue fruits, coupled with pepper spices. The tannin is what I like to think of as sort of just right. It's present, but it's not overpowering, nor bitter or stringent. And so it allows the wine to sort of have this really playful attitude at the dinner table. And gives it a nice long, gives it a pretty good drinking window. I mean, I always kind of think it's about 7 to 10 years as it shows vibrancy. But also I really love, showcasing this wine because it's us. I mean, it's essentially what we are, the mixture of these different sites on one location. We have 23 acres of the 34 acres of organically farmed grapes planted to Syrah. And of those 23 acres, we break them down into 2-acre blocks. So we have 11 blocks of Syrah, 7 different clones, 3 different rootstocks. So ultimately, we get a lot of expression of Syrah from one particular location. We don't buy offsite fruit for this program for any of the state wines. The only Syrah that I do buy some offsite is transverse, which the common core is moving from AVAs from west to east. And so a little bit of Larner goes into that as well. But the concept with the estate is to really showcase the your own varieties, in particular Syrah, because that's what we had the most planted of. But I think it does a great job showing that through this wine. So,
how is the Syrah market these days? I mean, it's always been probably my favorite grape. Sometimes I taste so many good Pinots that it's hard to say that I don't like Pinot a lot too, but I know it's had its ups and downs. There was a point when everyone thought it was going to be the next big thing, and that never seemed to quite get there. I think you guys have a unique position on it in Ballard Canyon because it is an appellation dedicated to it. But what's it like out there now trying to sell Syrah?
You know, Syrah is to me, and I may not have the ultimate answer on large case production because I think everybody who's sitting at this table makes small case productions of it. But it's an easy sell, and it's a great wine once it's tasted. The only reservation you have, or sometimes people have a predisposition to understanding what the wine is about. Some of that comes from confusion with Shiraz from Australia, which was adulterated with yellowtail and stuff like that. But when you're doing boutique wines, I don't want to sound like I'm tooting my own horn, but a lot of the Syrahs that I produce and when I'm pouring with public, they are shocked at the quality of the fruit and the wine made and the relatively reasonably priced. I think that's sort of the secret with Ballard Canyon, and the wines excel here, and we don't have to, go crazy on the farming. They feel very comfortable. So if you can keep your price realistic, the Syrah sells really well. What I find fascinating though is sometimes you go into these situations where you're pouring with somebody and they talk to you like, well, I don't know if I'm the biggest fan of Syrah, but then they start rattling off wines that are not varietally labeled, but are actually fancifully named, and they are Syrah. So you're like, okay, well, all right, let's play with that. Matt, I'm not really sure if it had a peak or if it had a trough. But what I have seen over the market, it seems to be consistent growth, although be it slow, at least it's consistent and it's growth. And that's paramount to me because I don't want it to flash in the pan. I will be the first to say that Sideways had some deleterious effects for varieties like Pinot, where you have an oversaturation, boom and bust. So if Syrah is just slowly increasing in complexity, notoriety, and sales, then I think we are doing the right thing. And Ballard's positioned itself to be sort of on the forefront of that, spearheading multiple price points. I mean, my Syrah goes from 36. We have some Stoltman Syrahs that go close to 99. Honada I think is like 150. So you have a gamut, and so I think that's great because it showcases Syrah has great price tolerance and quality for that price tolerance.
Great. All right, well, let's finish on the Kimsey Syrah 2015 and then get you guys on with the rest of your Thursday. Matt, tell us a little bit about this wine and tell us about ageability of Syrah in general and particularly from Ballard Canyon, which I think is one of the best aging wines out there. So
yeah, I mean that's such a fascinating conversation because we're all learning it together, right? Like we can't taste a 47 Ballard Canyon Syrah and say, ooh la la, I told you it was going to last for 70 years, right? We don't have that. We're at the forefront here. And, when I ended up taking this job back in 12 to work with Nancy and Bill, I wanted to only take, a position if it was really working with an estate vineyard that I believed in and owners who wanted to canonize that special property. And sort of that was the case here. And the Syrah was the one that jumped out first. And to me, Grenache has caught up, but Syrah was just from even young Syrah vines. And I'm sure Edgar and Steve and, Michael, I think you can speak to this as well, but Syrah wants to come out and just be gorgeous. It's this vine that even from young vines just wants to make these epically perfect bottles. And over time at Kimsey, I know that ageability has increased, which isn't shocking. But from the time we made our 12 to the time we made this 15, even in a range of 3 years, to me, the dry extract, the power, the kinetic energy inside seemed to really increase with every vintage. 15 was the first vintage to me this wine to me is a baby. It's almost like embryonic. It's crazy. And yet with 3 or 4 or 5, maybe 6 days open, it starts to reveal this far more beautifully evolved phase, right? And that to me speaks of another decade ahead of it. But just because a wine will go that long doesn't necessarily mean that that's how long we should wait to drink it. And for me, with the Kimsey 2015 Syrah, what I do now is I'll open a bottle, I'll decant it, and I'll drink it 24 hours later. And to me, that really unlocks the potential of Ballard Canyon Syrah, which is, in first, it's kind of impenetrable from a sun vintage where Mother Nature took 55 to 75% of our fruit. From poor set and from heat conditions and shrivel and whatever it might have been. But that kind of impenetrable nose, and all of a sudden an hour later, you're like, oh my goodness, there's black pepper spice. And there's, I think Matt Ketman, I think you wrote this incredible tasting note years ago. And I know I've pinged you about it a whole bunch, but I think it was about a Roussac Syrah. And it was something about like a corner of a tri-tip that was grilled and a little bit crispy. And it had an Indian rub, like Indian spice rub. And then it had like some reduced lingonberry sauce or something. I mean,
that's right.
Shame on you for writing words like that, but they're spot on. And to me, like when Ballard Canyon Syrah opens up, that's so spot on. And I think about your writing so eloquently about it. All of a sudden, it goes from this impenetrable kind of almost brooding presence to this floral, explosively elegant wine. And at the end of the day, I mean, when do we drink them? Based on the wines we've had today, I'd love to have that conversation, because I've had Edgar's Syrahs and Grenaches, and they're so beautiful out of the gate, but I'm sure they age impeccably. I've had Michael Larner's. I've had all the Roussac wines that Steve's made, and they have two options. There's opportunities for days. They don't necessarily need to be consumed young, much like the Kimsey. Where do we recommend? And I Michael, I wrote down here, you said 7 to 10 years. From my limited experience, I've been here for 16 years, and I think you're probably right. I find so much joy in Ballard Canyon Syrah from like year 5 to year 12. But let's have this same meeting in 10 years and we'll figure it out.
Well, and as someone that has a Stella wine, I think your answer is you should buy a case and try one every year, right?
You should buy 5 cases and try a case every year. That's what you should do.
There you go.
I think one of the funnest things for me, sorry to jump in there, but I think one of the funnest things about what Kimsey Vineyard has to offer is it's a wine that is, you can produce it youthfully and put it in the market, but it has the legs to go the age, right? So, the new project that I'm hoping to be able to showcase 100% Grenache and 100% Syrah, because I love making this blend, but like I feel like I'm taking the stage from each varietal to kind of shine on their own when they're so delicious, and I'm just putting it together. And I'm like, so a project that unfortunately defunct itself within the same year we launched it, left the opportunity for me to just retake it and run with it myself. So we did 100% Kimsey Vineyard from 2016, and I left it in the barrel for 29 months. I think maybe 2 months too late just because of the logistics of bottling, but it still came out with some really good depth and good structure behind it. And it was kind of fun to go down to the Garage's Festival and showcase it down in Bilton with you guys down there. And Bill was there showcasing, I think it was the same vintage. And so it was kind of cool to showcase, 2 producers from the same vineyard and so on. But I think that that's kind of the inspiration of this whole new project for me, is to be able to showcase the 100% Grenache from Kimsey Vineyard, and also be able to give the opportunity to produce that 100% Syrah. Because when it comes to blending it, I feel like, they're great wines, but I think that like they might be fighting one another at times. So I want to kind of like have the opportunity to showcase it as a blend, but also showcase them individually. And I think the barrel aging stuff that I'm trying to do too is push it beyond that 18 to 22 month kind of aging in the barrel a little bit. But at the same time, what I'm trying to captivate, just for the financial thing in my back of my mind, is like, you got to release it ready to go where people can drink it. But I also feel that we can also trap it in the bottle and start storing it away for a good year and a half, then release it. And that's kind of the game that I'm starting to shift into. It's really kind of trapping it in the bottle, but then releasing it to the consumer when I think it's ready, instead of just keeping the economics behind me, pushing things into the bottle a little bit sooner and releasing it a little bit sooner too.
Right.
And I agree that I don't know, I always tell customers, my wines are super approachable at the beginning, but right now I cracked open a 2010 Mis Pasos, which is 50% Syrah, 25 Tempranillo, and 25 Merlot that I made back then, with the mindset of it wasn't going to be a wine that I wanted people to consume within the first 5 years. I wanted a wine to be consumed within like that 5 and on, maybe the 7 to the 8th year window. And I feel that like we're drinking the 2014 E Square from Kimsey, and yeah, the Syrah is still driving it, is carrying it. It's pretty well put together still. We're like, I think, 6 years old in the bottle now. So it's like, it's getting there. It's that 5 to 7 year window that I wish I had the economics to be able to bottle and store it and release it 3 years later. That way people can hopefully lay it down for another extra 2 years before they drink it. But
Great. Krista had a question for you, Edgar, and I think Michael answered it, but I have a question to add on to it. She asked, you're doing a project that has 100% Syrah, 100% Petite Syrah, I think, 100% Grenache, and then the third one was, or the fourth one was Cab Franc, I think. But do you have a special name for that project, or is it just under Bodega de Edgar?
It's called Songs Wine. It's, as you talk to any winemaker in the cellar, there's always music playing. And for me, music is playing from when I wake up till I fall asleep. I'm driving around, there's music. And I think that from a harvest to harvest, there's nuances of things that kind of come back to life, whether it's movies, whether it's a new album, whether, I still have Jack Johnson in the back of my mind from 2013 when my little guy was born. So I have some beautiful songs in the back of my head that I remember, every harvest, it seems like we all create a playlist. So for me, I fell in love with wine, I think, because it's almost like music. I belong to some of the membership clubs that otherwise I wouldn't have any business. If I wasn't in this business, I have no business buying Saxons and Equinum, the amount of wine that I buy. But I love both of those guys for what they're doing. And I think that like even Jonata, when I do get it, it's a special bottle of wine to get. I think whenever I'm finding myself in Los Olivos, it's fine to go search Larner Vineyard stuff and Larner himself. But when it comes to producing wine, it's almost like music. You gotta test it out there. You gotta sample it out before you actually can create that cool album. So Songs Wine is a very small 300 case project that is being launched off this fall, and we're gonna release the Grenache and the Syrah together this fall. We're bottling everything in 2 weeks, but we're releasing the Cab Franc. Unfortunately, got overshadowed by Merlot this year. So the Merlot is going to be the first introduction of the Bordeaux varieties into that program. The Cabernet Franc eventually will make itself into the scene, but I think the Cabernet Franc that I have is delicious, but the Merlot is better. So I'm going to go with the Merlot and the Petit Syrah. But the whole hopes of introducing Cabernet Franc by itself in the near future, it's part of that program. So the cool thing that I'm going to do is the box is going to look different, just like some of these guys that I look up to do. Different box release. The name of the wines will change every season because there's a new playlist every season to play with. And so that's kind of the inspirational, the anthem songs that I've grown up with will be the names of the wines, and they change every year. And I'm also doing it vaguely where, there's a bunch of guys that have covered the same title song. So that way I don't get in trouble with them.
Great. Cool. Well, I think we've taken up enough of everyone's time, and I hope it was informative and delicious, as I thought it was. Chris has a quick question. What are you going to do with that Cab Franc then? Put it in a different bottling, or hang on to it and bottle it later?
We're going to hang on to it. We're going to see what shines maybe a couple months from now, and if it's something that is worth kind of giving it a time. Because I'm blessed now that I'm getting to the financial spot to where I don't have to rush things to the bottles. I'm letting the kids tell me when they're ready to leave home. And that's kind of the most beautiful thing, is that like, I only have one guy in my life, and he's 6 years old. So all the barrels that I have in house are the rest of my kids. So I have to like make sure they leave the house at the right time.
Yeah, great. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions for anybody here? Any parting words from any of our winemakers? Well, if not, then I will say thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Lacey for organizing all of this. I hope you guys learned something and got some good wines in the process. And I know you'll have all these people's contact information if you need to reach out for other stories or whatever. And without further ado, I guess we'll get on with our Thursdays and the rest of our weekend. So
yeah, Matt, let me jump in real quick and say one thing. I think to really understand any given region, I think we're all on the same page. You got to see the place, and you got to walk the vineyards. And the beauty of Ballard Canyon is you can walk you could walk the whole appellation in 20 minutes. I mean, it's you can really, just by getting your feet on the ground, understand this region better than any tasting, regardless of how wonderful it was like today. Like, to really understand this place, you got to walk from, you know, the southwestern corner all the way up to the northeastern edge, and just walk the soils. And we just have this incredibly tight-knit group of estate producers here. And really, there are very few regions in the world that I think you can grasp in a day in the best way possible. And Ballard Canyon is certainly at the top of that list. So hopefully, look, when all this mayhem is over, we can all welcome you out here, and we can break bread and pop bottles and have a great day walking through the vineyards. I know we could
maybe Ruben will make some tacos for everybody, and there'll be a mariachi band too, and it'll be a great day.
We'll go swimming. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Come on. Let's make it happen.
I can walk from winery to winery, and hopefully each one of you will give me some wine too. So I'm good to do that.
We'll make that happen.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thanks
All right,
so much.
thank you all.
This was terrific.
Thanks so much for joining, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
This was great.